So in many ways, the multifamily market has been the story of the summer. Owners who borrowed at ultra-low rates with floating rate debt have begun to come up against some distress after the Fed's aggressive rate hikes and the fact that rent growth has largely plateaued across the country. The Sun Belt has absolutely been the poster child for this, but a similar story has begun to play out in New York City among rent-stabilized landlords. Rent-stabilized buildings, particularly those that are majority regulated, they've begun to see a small uptick in defaults over the past few months. And context tells us that those delinquencies could be a sign of a longer trend. I want to give a quick bit of background here. So about 4 years ago, New York State passed this revolutionary package of legislation. The 2019 rent law effectively capped the routes owners had to raise rents and therefore revenue on their buildings. And the industry was really vocal about this when it passed. They said this is going to make it very difficult for owners to cover expenses with existing revenue. And among those expenses were mortgages. So fast forward 4 years, and we're beginning to see that struggle play out in real time. I recently reported that New York Community Bank in the second quarter saw an uptick in delinquent multifamily loans. So this is notable because New York Community Bank, after Signature Bank failed, became the largest de facto lender to New York rent stabilized in the state. So the fact that multifamily ticked up implies that rent stabilized loans may be having problems. The other factor there is that we know the industry doesn't think these rent stabilized loans are good because when Signature failed and some of its loans sold back in the spring, its CRE book, a lot of which was rent stabilized, did not sell. And folks in the industry sort of took that to mean those loans were toxic. What I found particularly interesting about this earnings call, though, was that NYCB's CEO, Thomas Kangemi, he said in this morning call, no multifamily delinquencies on our books. I looked at the earnings report. That was not the case. I saw that loans marked 90 days or more past due had actually surged 154% in the second quarter from the first quarter. So not only had we seen that multifamily delinquencies were happening, but there was an increase from the second to the first, from the first from the fourth. Seeing that discrepancy, I wanted to look at whether NYCB had actually foreclosed on any owners and maybe it hadn't shown up in the second quarter earnings. I looked on court records online. Lo and behold, there had been 8 foreclosures filed by Flagstar, which is a subsidiary of NYCB, in July. Those foreclosures were interesting for 2 reasons. The first is that the owners, obviously, they defaulted on their mortgages. They were struggling to pay that, but they were also struggling to pay their expenses. So their buildings had sort of fallen into disrepair. They weren't paying for utilities. They weren't paying for insurance. The prices of both have surged in the past several years. And the fact that that had happened, that's something that CHIP, the Community Housing Improvement Program, has foretold of for years, basically saying, like, without adequate revenue, these buildings are going to decay. The other aspect is that these buildings were all majority rent stabilized, which I mentioned before. So that led me to believe that they would be more heavily impacted by the rent law. And possibly that could have led to the foreclosures. The contrast being if the buildings had maybe like 50% market rate units and rent growth on those units could have compensated for the stagnant rents on the stabilized units. So all that being said, we're going to be watching this over the next few months. It could, be a one-off, but it also could signal the beginning of a wider wave of distress for rent-stabilized multifamily.